Hi all, my name is Jill Love and I'm an online MAG student. I'm presenting on the article Lifespan Development and Culture by Patricia Greenfield, Heidi Keller, Ashley Maynard, and Lolita Suzuki. Before I dive into the article, I'll tell you a little about myself. I graduated from Pepperdine University with a degree in intercultural communications. A few years later, my husband and I decided to get our MBAs at the UCLA Anderson School of Management. While I was in school, I got laid off, so I decided to combine my love of seniors and my business background by working in the senior care industry. Working at a retirement community inspired me to go back to school to get my MAG, and now I'm just 2 classes away from graduating. The purpose of this article is to understand culture's role in lifespan development by analyzing various approaches. Greenfield et al. Started the article with a statement that summed up their paper's purpose very well. They said, quote, "Human development can be understood as the lifelong interactional processes of perceiving and experiencing culture as triggered from the outside, created from the inside, and co-created with others. Thus, processes of development and processes of culture are inexplicably intertwined," just like the vines in this picture. The first section covered 3 conceptual approaches in cultural lifespan psychology. The first is the eco-cultural approach, which links the ecological environment and modes of subsistence, that is, jobs, to child rearing, child personality, and adult personality. It focuses on the external forces on a person's development. Second, the socio-historical tradition talks a lot about roles of subsistence practices and trades, as well as the social roles of parents, teachers, peers, and siblings in shaping a person's life. Finally, the authors discussed cultural pathways that shape a person's conception of self. The independent pathway reveals a cultural value system of individualism and teaches the person to be separate from the social context, whereas the interdependent pathway reveals a value system of collectivism and teaches the person to see herself as connected to the social context. Parents and society reinforce these pathways and value systems through various developmental nodes. In the second half of the article, the authors described developmental pathways in a multicultural society, and they explain that, quote, "Often the developmental pathway of the dominant majority tends to be taken for granted as normative or even universal, rather than as cultural," end quote. In a multicultural society like ours, it's important to understand that we may perceive people's decisions negatively if they don't agree with our cultural models. For this reason, school can be particularly challenging for children who are raised in different cultural contexts because they're being taught divergent value systems at home and at school. Since this article did not cover a specific study or experiment, it was really more of a collection of theories on development and culture. Unfortunately, this made for a very dry read, in my opinion. Also, in the first half of the article, I thought there was too much terminology, with too few examples to make sense of them. I had to read certain sections a few times to make sure I was grasping the information. I have a good friend who publishes scientific articles regularly, and she said, "You should never make the reader work hard to understand what you're saying." So, points off for that. Similarly, since the article covered so many concepts, I think that graphics would have helped aid in understanding. I put this graphic together to help me understand the 3 main approaches of lifespan psychology: the more external cultural pressures on development, ecocultural, interactive elements, socio-historical, and finally the more internal and family-driven elements, cultural pathways. Overall, though, the article was very well organized and the logical layout helped the sections to flow well. I also appreciated the glossary at the beginning so I wasn't completely lost while reading the article. I also liked the sections on cultural pathways as well as the multicultural perspective. The discussions of individualism versus collectivism, independence and interdependence, and how values sometimes conflict in a multicultural society were both interesting and relevant to me. I particularly liked their illustrations of diverging value systems in the classroom and in girls' soccer team environments. As someone who grew up in a bicultural household, I thought the authors were spot on. So I thought I'd include my story to bring this content to life. My mother is from the Philippines and my dad is an American. My parents met when my dad was serving in the Peace Corps in the Philippines. As soon as they married, they moved to my dad's hometown in Oregon. Looking back, I can see how my parents worked hard to find a balance between the collectivist orientation of Filipino culture with the individualist orientation of the United States. For the most part, I grew up in a very American household, so my mom was intentional about passing along her heritage. She even co-founded a Filipino-American club to pass elements of Filipino culture to kids like me growing up in the United States. That's me on the right with my mom and younger sister wearing Filipino outfits for a traditional dance. My mom's entire immediate family eventually immigrated to the United States and lived nearby, so I grew up with a very strong sense of family, faith, and responsibility to others. For the most part, though, my sisters and I developed a strong sense of American individualism and culture, and living in the U.S. has diluted the collectivist orientation that I see in my mom's generation. The authors talked about divergent value systems and explained, quote, "This reduction of the collectivist orientation among immigrants across the generations results from a contrasting set of priorities in the individualist host culture," close quote. So here I am. My Venn diagram of identity is probably similar to other second-generation children, growing up with a predominantly individualist perspective, but with an appreciation for the collectivist cultural elements that helped shape us. Asian cultures are traditionally known for their collectivism and interdependence, yet the concept of filial piety seems to be eroding due to culture change. In South Korea, the suicide rate among older adults is rising dramatically, as parents don't want to be a burden to their children who are working hard to move up in the world. In fact, the use of a specific pesticide was so commonly used in elder suicide that the government outlawed it last year. Also, in China, the government passed a law requiring children to visit their parents regularly because society has changed so much. A few years ago, I even gave a group of Chinese investors a tour of my retirement community because they're trying to deal with an aging society with fewer young people available to care for them. In these countries, ecocultural change has happened because young adults are moving from rural areas to cities in order to find jobs. Since multiple generations of families no longer live within the same household, socio-historical traditions and family relationships have changed. Inevitably, I think this is changing the very basis for the collectivist cultural pathways that have been in place for millennia, particularly regarding filial piety. I don't think they're eroding completely, but the globalization of the economy is having direct effects on family expectations and the transfer of culture from generation to generation. Just as my Filipino family's sense of collectivism has been diluted within American society, I believe change is also happening in China, South Korea, and likely other countries as well due to globalization. This concludes my presentation, but if you'd like to contact me, please feel free to email me. Thanks so much for listening.